We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is a showdown coming between Muslims and non-Muslims in the West? Is a so-called clash of civilizations inevitable? Not necessarily, according to this man, Altikriti. Shortly after 9/11, he founded the Cordoba Foundation in the UK, a Muslim Brotherhood-linked group keen to advance the notion that there is no inherent conflict between the West and Islam. This, despite the establishment of the Islamic State and increasing worries in countries such as the UK that the war in Iraq and Syria might find outlets in Europe as well. But Altikriti holds on to his steadfastness, and he clearly is seen as a man worth listening to. Last year, he met President Obama in the White House, together with his advisors concerned about the situation in Iraq, where incidentally Altikriti's family comes from. We sat down with Altikriti to get a better sense of his organization, his philosophy, and what he thinks the Muslim community should and should not do. To be clear, we did this before the attacks in Paris earlier this week. Thank you very much, Mr. Altikriti, for talking to Al Jazeera. Now, you are the founder of the Cordoba Foundation. On your website, you describe the organization as an independent think tank promoting intercultural dialogue and positive coexistence among civilizations. You speak again on the website on the need to eliminate ignorance or fear of the other. You say that people can be educated, and that in turn would lead to mutual appreciation, respect, and acceptance. I'm going to ask you later about specifically some of the groups that might be considered the other, but in that little introduction to your website, what is it exactly that you mean? What is it exactly that the Cordoba Foundation tries to do?
The idea of the Cordoba Foundation came in at the back of 9/11 and various narratives that emerged, suggesting that the clash of civilizations in the presence of Islam, when one of those civilizations is Islam, is inevitable. It's a rehash of the Samuel Huntington theory that a clash of civilization is inevitable. The idea of the Cordoba Foundation is that such a clash is neither necessary nor inevitable, nor is it within the DNA of either Islam or any other civilization for that matter, to intrinsically clash with the other or fail to coexist with the other. The idea was that if people worked hard enough to create a reason to clash, then a clash would occur. But otherwise, really such an event wouldn't be necessary. And for that reason, we came up with the name Cordoba, something intrinsically European at the very heart of Europe, something that rehashes positive memories of a time where people of various faiths and religions and backgrounds not only tolerated each other, suffered the existence of the other, but actually managed to live side by side and create something which is quite wonderful.
And yet, so you say you created it after 9/11, and yet, 13 years after 9/11, we're living another very serious clash right now with ISIL. How do you see the emergence of ISIL, and how do you live and see the Western reaction to it?
I think that's a very important question, because the very same question came about when Al-Qaeda, for instance, became quite prominent in both Afghanistan and then in Iraq and elsewhere also in the Magharibiya, for instance, the North African Al-Qaeda, the Yemen Al-Qaeda and the such. And we asked the same question: how on earth did Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, for instance, become such an icon of various crowds and constituents? And now we're asking the same of ISIS. And I fear that unless we take a very hard look at ourselves, that in future, maybe not in the so distant future, we'll be asking the same question of something else probably.
When you say take a look at ourselves, who do you mean?
I think the international community, the community that claims that it's the bedrock of democracy, that it's the bedrock of human rights. The West generally, yes. I think it's quite important that we do reassess our policies, we do assess our narratives, we do take a very deep look and hard look at the way in which we've been treating the very ideals that the West was built upon. I think it's quite problematic that we are now in the aftermath of the revelation of how the CIA, for instance, have been behaving over the past 12, 13 years, how various intelligence around the world, following Western governments who proclaim democracy, freedom and human rights and claim to forbid torture and the like. It's quite problematic, and this resonates quite loudly with youngsters who feel that they do not belong, that they feel that they're not being represented by the politicians, by the leaders, whether they be community, faith, social leaders. They're not being represented, and all of a sudden they hear this distant sound that talks of quite thrilling adventures, creating a real change. Good or bad, for the young sometimes it doesn't really matter.
And when you say the young, I mean obviously here in the West, specifically in Britain, there's a lot of British-born or certainly British-raised young, late teens, early 20s that go. That's the group that you're talking about. I'm
talking about those, but not exclusively those. I mean, when we talk about those, it's quite interesting from my point of view, and many observers like myself, who find it quite intriguing sometimes, how that often when we find young Muslims excelling in arts, in sports, in politics, in science and the such, we proclaim them to be products of the West, which is fair. But then when they go off track and they join the likes of Al-Qaeda or ISIS, all of a sudden they're an Islamic problem.
Many will say here in the UK that a lot of these kids, and as you mentioned, not always Muslim, often they're converts from other religions, invariably young, that the reason that they then end up going to Syria and Iraq is because they are, quote unquote, radicalized. So they will say that it's not so much a product of the West, but I guess a product of people that are preying on those young minds and using them for their own purposes.
I mean, when you talk about those youngsters have been radicalized, I would love to know exactly what it is that what we mean by the term radicalized. You see, now we're using terms which we haven't really spent much time identifying or defining.
Well, I suppose that the general consensus would be that it's a young person here in the UK, and let's just remind ourselves that there's hundreds of thousands of young people from the Arab countries and Africa that risk their lives to cross the Mediterranean to reach a country like the UK. So I guess by radicalization, what people would mean is these kids, these young people, decide to go and risk their lives for a cause that they're often not even very clear about. You listen to some of the interviews, they don't really know the details, even the sort of wide issues in Syria and Iraq, but they just choose to go there. I mean, the question I'd like to ask you is, whose problem do you think it is? I mean, obviously it's everyone's, but is it specifically the Muslim community? Because what you hear often here in the UK is the Muslim community must do more.
Yeah.
A, do you think it is up to them to do more? And B, what should they do?
I am one of the disagreeing voices in constantly barraging the Muslim community to do more. I think that the Muslim community has gone out of its way to often speak at times when it really didn't need to speak. I mean, the people who committed the attack on the Twin Towers were people who decided to go on a particular criminal cause, to commit murder. Those who committed the attacks on London on the 7th of July 2005, to me they were murderers. They went and decided to kill innocent people. That's the end of it. We would never presume it correct to ask any leaders of any particular faith if members of their faith happen to commit any particular crime. It's therefore something that we wonder about and we worry about and we are extremely concerned about when Muslims particularly are often asked to come forward and to show that they condemn. Had Muslims not condemned these attacks, with the fact that we have 1.6, 1.7 billion Muslims around the world, we would have seen dozens of these attacks every single day. The fact that we don't means that actually Muslims, by far and large, and we could throw figures, 90%, 95%, 99%, condemn killing innocent people, condemn violence in trying to create a particular political reality or social reality, condemn forcing people to behave in a particular way, to worship in a particular way, to dress in a particular way. Most Muslims condemn that. Had they not, we would have seen far more attacks, far more attacks, not only in Iraq and Syria, maybe in the West as well. But the fact that we don't, I think, is quite telling.
But so now we are, though, seeing, I think it's in the hundreds of young people from the UK and the rest of Europe going, which I guess, if nothing else, it just makes it an issue for the Muslim community because it's their children. So it's hundreds of parents and brothers and uncles and aunts who will worry about their children going to something that they don't understand. So I appreciate your point about not having to, but what could the Muslim community do?
Well, to be honest, beyond what they're doing right now, I think very, very little.
Which is what?
Well, at this moment of time, I mean, there is just one very important point that is often brought up when we read into intelligence reports about various perpetrators of various violent acts or terrorist acts, here or elsewhere, is that those aren't necessarily extremely religious people. They don't go to the local mosque. People don't often know them. And if they did, they would be part of a congregation that would be told, week in, week out, that their duties as Muslims is to show the true face of Islam, is to, treat their neighbors and their, fellow citizens with respect and with dignity, is to, create the kind of conditions, political, social, economic, whatever they are, in the way that a Muslim ought to, with beautiful preaching, with behaving in a beautiful way and the such. I would find it extremely difficult to believe that there is any kind of mosque, any kind of open congregation anywhere up and down the country, and we have thousands of mosques and places of prayer, where the imam, the preacher, stands up and calls for people to actually catch the next train to Syria, the plane to Syria. I would doubt that very, very much. And but
there are groups. I mean, they may use the mosque as a link, but there are groups.
Most of those, well, I'm sure there are. And again, that's not unique to Islam and Muslims. But nevertheless, I think that most of those groups, they operate not in mosques, but they operate on the social media. Today, the social media is the biggest recruiter of those people. That's how people know how to join, know where to go, where to travel, who to hook up with, on the Syrian borders, for instance, or on the borders between Turkey and Iraq. So it's even if you close down a particular mosque because there was someone who frequented it that turned out to be a terrorist, even if you banned a particular imam, even if you, created conditions where such an interaction face-to-face couldn't happen, we live in a world where you can't ban a particular discussion from happening.
Especially the government here in the UK is trying. First of all, they're trying to clamp down on a lot of these young people that are going to Syria and then coming back because they're scared of the message that they might bring. There's talk of, withholding passports, not allowing these fighters back in. What do you make of that kind of reaction?
It's not enough, because once again we're dealing with terrorism, and with let's take the case of ISIL right now. We're talking about it and talking about the way to resolve it under security conditions. When you can't create a counter-intelligence, a counter-radicalization, a counter-terrorism, a counter-extremism plan in order to fight an idea like ISIL. It doesn't work. You can't wage war on an idea. You can't wage war on an idea.
So then what should they do? What should the UK, the US government, anyone living here, what should they do?
I think that the first thing is to start asking the question, what should we do? With an open mind to accept all sorts of thoughts. The problem is...
Like what? What would be those thoughts?
Well, one of the things I would suggest is don't clamp down on those who disagree with your approach. Today we are, since Egypt, July 2013, we have been at war with what we term as political Islam, what we term, as the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, what do we expect to happen from that? Where will people go? Where will the youngsters go? Who will give them hope that they can actually change political realities, but without having to carry a gun? How will we be able to convince young men and women that actual change, real democratic, free, dignified futures are possible, but without having to bomb anything or anyone, without having to shed blood? If you've banned that particular thought, where will people go? Now they're arguing with me and others. They're saying, well, hang on. The Muslim Brotherhood, political Islam, every other so-called democratic Islamic party has been banned. So why on earth should we believe in that cause anymore? It doesn't work. The only thing going, the only game going in town today is ISIL, and that's what we're going to join.
Let's speak about banning, because your own organization just a few weeks ago was banned by the UAE. It was put on a terrorism list along with Boko Haram and ISIL and Al Qaeda. I guess that connection, and the UAE says it's because of the links to the Muslim Brotherhood. I guess there is also that suspicion that continues here in the UK. Let me just read you a quote by Andrew Gilligan. He's a journalist for The Telegraph. He says, the Cordoba Foundation works closely with other British extremist, his word, groups which seek the creation of an Islamic dictatorship or caliphate in Europe. I mean, that is quite an accusation. And I guess to a lot of people in the UK, they will say, well, it's that sort of language that radicalizes, again, the word used here, a lot of young people. Because when it comes to democracy and freedom, Western countries will tell you, well, we actually have that here.
Well, it's...
How do you respond to the accusation, the sort of Andrew Gilligan quote?
Well, Andrew Gilligan has been someone who's been on the other side of the narrative and discourse for a number of years, and therefore, I've stopped taking him seriously. However, let me come back to the accusation itself, because this is something that we've been. I mean, we're approaching our 10th anniversary, and I would say from the very first year, these accusations have been leveled against us, and I think it worries people when certain setups like ourselves, and when we're not alone, there are tens of others like ourselves, when we start to actually engage and have an impact on the public. And our constituents, by the way, aren't Muslim. We deal with the British public, with all faiths, with all ethnicities, with all races, everywhere, not just in the UK, but throughout Europe and across Asia and Africa and North America. And we have a big impact. And I think it worries a lot of people when we do that, particularly when we carry the kind of message that we do, and we challenge the way in which the government is behaving. Why is it such a problem for any particular party, whether it be Muslim or otherwise, to come and say, we believe that, Islam should be run under Islamic law? I might think that that's ridiculous, but, if they're doing it according to the law of the country, why is it that we've become so intolerant? Why is it that we've become so touchy, so, sensitive to these differences? We want everyone to stand in a particular line that we recognize, and anyone who stands in a line that we don't, we can't tolerate. Since when was that? And therefore, why is it that we're so afraid? And that's precisely when I say that we challenged the way in which the government was behaving, in that all of a sudden, whilst the government started off by fighting and searching for those who were hell-bent on creating havoc, on blowing up people, on killing and shedding blood, while that was fine, but then all of a sudden it shifted to also pursuing people whom had a particular position on Palestine, who had a particular position on, for instance, the American and British invasion and occupation in Iraq. And all of a sudden, it stopped at being merely people who wanted to do harm unto others. It became everyone, a net so wide, so broad, that it included people whom had a particular political position on what was happening in Palestine and Israel, on what was happening on Iraq. And all of a sudden, we became this society whereby we can't even have a political discussion anymore.
So the UK government right now has an ongoing review on the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood has obviously suffered political setbacks in Egypt and reputational setbacks elsewhere. What do you think it could do to try to fight against that?
Well, first of all, the setbacks that you mention are setbacks created by a military coup, with the tacit support and observation doing absolutely nothing by the world powers. That's the setback. And it's like decrying or criticizing a young chap for being beaten up by a heavyweight boxer with everyone watching and clapping. I think it's unfair, and it speaks more widely not about the Muslim Brotherhood itself. I think it speaks loudly about the position of so-called democratic governments. Let's face it. We as the UK, Europe and the European countries, America and others, we watched as a fledgling democracy was being crushed by a military coup. And we're still watching as every single human rights organization worth its salt speaks volumes about the violations, sometimes even war crimes, committed in Egypt. We still watch and think about how, how best to do business with Egypt without seeming as though we are, condoning those violations. I think it's quite problematic. The review itself, I think, is a condemnation of the position of the British government rather than anything else. I think that rather than Britain standing aside and saying, listen, we're not going to stand for a democracy, regardless of that democracy, who it represents, that democracy being crushed, and also add salt to the wound by investigating it. There isn't any reason why the Muslim Brotherhood should be investigated. There wasn't any violent attack that was...
So leaving Europe, I mean, in the UAE, as we mentioned before, the Muslim Brotherhood has actually been decreed a terrorist organization. Many of its members now moving, for example, to Turkey. I mean, I'm trying to get from you what the thinking is behind the move, what you think the overall shape of the Brotherhood is going to have in the coming months and years.
Well, I'll tell you what, I mean, in regards with the UAE government, I think that what has happened is absolutely preposterous. I mean, as you put it in your previous question, the piling of organizations such as the Cordoba Foundation, such as Islamic Relief, which is part of the Disaster Emergency Committee, CARE in America, the Council for American Islamic Relations, and hundreds of others, dozens of others across Europe, all quite recognized by their governments, all working hand in hand with various government agencies for decades now, with the likes of Boko Haram, with the likes of ISIL, with the likes of Al-Qaeda, I think is absolutely ridiculous. But quite dangerous as well, because now what the UAE government has done is, by its cavalier usage of the term terrorism, of throwing that charge to anyone whom it doesn't like. I mean, there's a difference between me not liking a particular setup, but then accusing it of something so heinous as terrorism charges. So I think what has happened is that actually the UAE government, through this particular list, has devalued the term the charge of terrorism. And I think what it has done is to muddy the waters even further, so that essentially any young Muslim anywhere around the world now doesn't really know, because even a charitable organization, the weight, the legacy of Islamic Relief, it can't be trusted anymore. So who can be trusted? Almost no one can be trusted.
At the start of 2014, you met President Barack Obama in the US. What did you talk about? The talk was definitely about Iraq. I mean, I think that at the time... And this was pre-ISIL, obviously, or at least before the explosion of ISIL.
Yes, I mean, ISIL was still localized in the western part of Iraq, and there were worries about how to deal with ISIL. And at the time, I recall that the talk was about, something around the 300, 400 fighter mark. Those kinds of numbers of ISIL. Now we're talking all of a sudden about 60, 70,000. And at the time, unfortunately, the kind of proposals that were put to the American administration, which involved a radical restructuring of their policies regarding Iraq, of how they saw Iraq, of how they behaved in Iraq, of how they spoke about Iraq. Those were all scoffed, and at the time the administration was more concerned with securing the oil pipelines, with what they termed security along certain parameters that weren't really conducive to the public Iraqi interest, I believe, in trying to continue to push the sectarian narrative when talking about Iraq and talking about the Shia region, the Sunni region, the Kurdish region, as though three separate, unique regions which needed to be addressed differently. And the failure to recognize that at the very depth, at the very heart of Iraq's crisis, ISIL was merely a symptom. It wasn't the cause. The cause was that we had a state that had been set up in a very, very haphazard, very, very random, very, very amateurish way in 2003 that led to utter failure. A state so corrupt that it lingers at the very foot of the Transparency International list for the past 6-7 years, and ultimately with no way out.
Analyst Altikriti, thank you very much for talking.
Thank you, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.